All right, everyone. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, today we're actually going to be continuing what we started out with yesterday. But before we basically continue, thought it would be a good idea to tell you exactly what we have coming up, inshallah, because we've got a couple things to do and we're really close to concluding our classes, at least in the fiqh of marriage. And so we've got a couple things to do. Number one, we're going to be concluding this piece of it, which basically is talking about what's a female. So we only really have just a couple slides left. We're not going to be discussing more about that part, but inshallah, we'll just continue these slides and then we'll jump into the topic, which basically is the fiqh of divorce. So let me just show you fiqh of divorce. Fiqh of divorce is, I guess, a little um, it's probably a very painful subject to talk about and a lot of things to say, but inshallah, we're gonna make it really easy because I'm somebody that loves to break it down. I want the, whatever topic that we basically study to be something that you're capable of digesting, capable of understanding, and even capable of giving it later on. So this is really my goal. So once we get to the fiqh of divorce, the divorce is going to include any type of resolution. So whether we're talking about divorce, whether we're talking about khula', whether we're talking about ila, dhihar, all of that, that's inshallah going to be as part of the fiqh of divorce. Well, perhaps maybe not the li'an. Well, no, we should be included. So the li'an as well. Those are going to be really easy to cover, inshallah. And then we're going to be talking about iddah. So what is a iddah? What does it include? What does it mean? What are we supposed to be doing and all of that? And we're then going to be talking about child custody. So we'll be talking about child custody. That's not going to be too much, but we'll be talking about child custody and some details about child custody. And we will then consider that we will be then ready to conclude the fiqh of marriage because we covered pretty much everything. If there are certain topics that you think should have been included in the fiqh of marriage, I'd be happy to hear it. Just remind me perhaps of what it is other than those topics that I talked about. And inshallah, this is going to be really exciting. And after that, we will be doing the fiqh of worship. Fiqh of worship 2, not 1, because fiqh of worship 1 was about salah. Fiqh of worship 2 is about siyam. So it's going to be the fiqh of fasting, it's going to be the fiqh of zakah, it's going to be the fiqh of hajj. But we're not going to be capable of doing all of those in one semester. So you're going to see that stretching out exactly like what we're doing right now, stretching out into another semester because we need to finish these, and especially that they're being recorded. So we're getting fiqh of worship 2, which fiqh of siyam, and we're going to be talking about everything about fiqh of siyam. We're going to be going to the book Fiqh Sunnah, and we're going to be letting that take us along. And we will also be using al-Mulakhas al-Fiqhi as well. So alhamdulillah, like I would have the Arabi side and the English side. They would be next to each other. That way you could see both texts and go over that piece of it. So inshallah, it's going to be easy. So the fiqh of siyam, we've got the fiqh of zakah, and inshallah fiqh of hajj. And we were also supposed to be doing, or actually we did that last year, so we're not going to be doing the fiqh of janazah. We finished that with fiqh salah. So that would be basically finishing off all of the second piece of fiqh. And then the following year, I'm thinking of taking the fiqh of either priorities or the fiqh of maqasid al-sharia, the maqasid al-sharia and the legal maxims and all that. But we're going to go really detailed in that. So we're either going to take the fiqh of priorities or we're going to be taking the legal maxims. So we'll see what you would vote on. Okay, so this is just an overview of what we're going to be taking and what we're inshallah going to be planning in the future. So stay tuned. We've got a lot of work to do, and this is exciting. And I know we have dedicated girls right there. So inshallah, let's continue with that. And let's continue with what we started out yesterday. Well, the day before yesterday. The day before yesterday, and our typical story, we basically did how Islam builds houses and homes, and I'm not going to go over everything. And we really jumped into another slide, which is masculinity, femininehood, what is really the difference, and is there any difference? And we basically tried to go through, let's call it a Quranic lens, a Quranic path to basically define these for us, especially living in a day and age where, of course, absurdity is basically perhaps the main slogan of postmodernism. So we needed to really go back to Quran and Sunnah in order to help us see the indoctrination and help us see all of that influence that may sometimes take over us, and without us realizing, it basically seeps into our hearts, into our minds, and then we would think of it as, hey, this is my own idea. I'm basically free. And of course, just as we always say, Harriet Tubman said, we could have been capable of freeing more slaves if only they had known that they were so. That's the same thing. Not until we are capable of recognizing, the shaitan straps and the shaitan um what do we call them? Like handcuffs and chains. Not until we recognize them are we capable of freeing ourselves from the shaitani influence to really being free. And of course, seeing all of that. It starts with first, you got to liberate your mind and then liberate your body from all the different influences of shahwat. So liberating your mind from the shubuhat, from the different misconceptions, liberating your body from shahwat, from the different lusts and desires. So you're going to liberate your body, you're going to liberate your mind, you're going to liberate your body, you're going to liberate your soul, basically from all the differences right there in order to be free in al-ihsan. So of course we went in details with masculinity and we went in some details with femininehood. Although we talked about femininehood from a different side. So please do remind me. Hopefully, I'll remember to give you that one. The different things about, where was it? So right there. Oh dear, I actually lost it now. Hold on. We basically did this. Hold on, let me show you. Oh, I can't believe it. Oh no, here it is. So we did women in Quran. And let me show you what we did. We went over these details, women basically in the Quran, based on just different areas of understanding that. I'll translate that for you, inshallah, into English and make it available onto the website as well. Inshallah, we also went into some debate about the Queen of Saba. And was she necessarily aqila or a full-minded person, or was she also considered as what the Prophet ﷺ had said and described women as naqisatu aql? And we said al-aql here is speaking about determination and is not talking about intelligence. So we went in details with that one. I'm not going to go over it again. To make the story short, we said naqisatu aql is basically lacking determination and not lacking intelligence. And does Malikat Saba or the Queen of Saba actually show naqs aql or not? And we said, that debate between scholars that you had some scholars say, yes, she does actually show that she was lacking that aql by asking the people on what they thought would be the best way to deal with this opposing army that was heading their way, or at least that was asking them to surrender. Okay, and that was Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam. But of course, it definitely was also telling us that there was wisdom, there was diplomacy, there was guidance, and definitely was expressing, or at least the ayat were reflecting a woman that was a queen and also was making the best decisions. Okay, we also had talked about the two only figures in the Quran as evil female figures. It didn't really go in lots of details about these two women, so it wasn't like the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, the Old Testament, they would take us into all these women, Rahel and the daughters of Lut and all of those, and all the women in the Old Testament are promiscuous. A woman is promiscuous in the Old Testament and basically in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in Islam, in the Quran, only two women were considered as not necessarily promiscuous per se, but were not the supporters and advocating for Tawheed. Let's just basically end it right there. Okay, we also talked about women's psychology. You know, one thing I hated when I was basically influenced with the feminist mindset and, feminist mentality and all of that. I hated it when men or anyone would say that women were emotional. Absolutely hated it. And I felt that that was the most derogatory expression that you could use on women, because by expressing them that way, I used to think that that was very condescending, very derogatory, very not acceptable. And I used to actually think that that is not true and that the society basically paintbrushes them that way, and that that's not true. And right now we learn that science actually proves me wrong, that yes, women are more emotional. It's basically the way that their brain, the anatomy in their brain, their different, their psychology works differently. Women's psychology works differently, and it certainly affects their decision making. It certainly affects a lot of different things in their life, and definitely the social dynamics and the different things that they would basically behave in life. And well, that's because you would see that the Quran is letting us know that the key center, or the center why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created women, and which basically is the most holy position and the most sacred, the sacred mission that she is capable of doing, which basically is motherhood. Okay, that's that sacred mission. It doesn't mean if a woman cannot get pregnant, cannot get children, that doesn't mean that she's not capable of, delivering a sacred mission or being a person on a mission whatsoever. But certainly we're talking about as a default thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in at least the biology, the psychology of women and so forth. So letting us know that whether we're speaking about emotions or whether we're speaking about the different set of emotions, whether fear, love, worry, perhaps jealousy, perhaps motherhood, all of those are basically mentioned as by inference, we would find it in the Quran. And certainly that doesn't mean that men lack emotions. Well, of course not, because we had definitely seen the Prophet ﷺ, himself was actually full of emotions, whether when his son had died, or when Khadija had died, or when his uncle, or when perhaps lost some of those Sahaba and gave them a squeeze hug, or or even when basically was attacked, or perhaps maybe just in different scenarios and different circumstances. We had seen that the Prophet ﷺ himself, as a man, was full of emotions. It doesn't mean if you have emotions, it doesn't make that man lack masculinity, and it certainly does not make that woman basically too womany, if that's even a word, okay? All right, if that's, of course, it's not a word in English, but you understand what I mean. So it definitely does not make her too womany, or it does not make her basically lacking aql or away from her own biology or her own nature, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know that certainly this is what makes a woman. And yes, that basically makes her fit for a certain position, but certain positions we may need certain advocacy, just like when we're talking about as a wali, or perhaps a wali for marriage, at least, not for everything, or perhaps sometimes needing some time that we may not give her at least the authority to do talaq, but we'll probably do it differently, and we'll call that khulu'. So we'll basically have a set of different, let's call them precautions, to make sure that when the decision is made, it's not made based on an impulsive reaction to something, but is made after long thinking and after scrutinizing that decision before basically regretting such a decision. So we basically see that the Quran does recognize that women are basically more prone to emotions compared to men, and that we could see basically as an inference from numerous ayat in the Quran. So, okay, the other piece we talked about is women, bashfulness, and her body. Of course, women, bashfulness, and the body, we went in some details about women and shyness, and we said that the Quran does praise that shyness and regards it as something worthy of women and Muslim women basically replicating and embracing as part of what makes femininehood and what makes a woman's place, basically, whether what matches and what fits that, which is al-qarar fil bayt, and of course being at home instead of always being exposed in public. So we do see an ayah that made it really clear that وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنْ or وَقِرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنْ. We talked about both of those qira'at, the difference between qirna and qarna, and we said that what we learned from these two qira'at is the importance of not being exposed at least publicly and being out there, but it's basically emphasizing a very important treasure and a very important fortress that the woman basically needs to recognize, which is her own home, and not necessarily always being in public. So we really have to be careful, perhaps, in what fields our daughters go into when they would study, or perhaps what choices they would make in terms of probably what types of jobs that they would be getting, or what plans that they might be, needing in the future. So sometimes ladies, especially the older women, and what I mean by older women, I mean mothers that probably have girls that are going to be starting school. I mean, not, high school, but perhaps from high school, we're talking about girls wanting to choose their major. You might want to definitely, advise them to choose a major that is going to be something that will help her along when she would become a mother, when kids are basically, a thing and a center in her life, or a husband, or might need to work at home. And certainly not all jobs you can work from home, but do we necessarily as women have to be, competing with the guys on all jobs? So definitely not. We don't want to compete on all jobs, but we definitely need to recognize that there is a very important center that the Quran encouraged us to be in, which is a center within our homes and a center of our own biology, our own nature, which is motherhood. So very important to look ahead, and moms, please do mentor your daughters to make the right choices before they end up, needing to make the choice, should I risk my marriage, risk my children, or should I risk my job? So before we get into that, of course, we would have to plan ahead. And that's where the moms come in to basically say, hey, here's what's coming up. And before you get to that, junction and to that area, I want to tell you what's coming up ahead. And I would like to tell you that, prepare for that from now, because it will make your life easier. And of course, the feminist culture, the secular culture is pushing women. And I'll tell you, as somebody that used to work in St. Catherine University, what you would see on campuses, you would only see, yeah, they're encouraging you to go into certain fields, etc. But what you don't recognize is that there is an ideology, there is an agenda that is laid out by someone else, other groups, other political groups, ideological groups, and they would be the ones to say, well, here's what we need to encourage women to study. Here's what we need more women to go into such and such field. This is what we need to encourage them. And you will see that they will have perhaps banners out there, perhaps maybe a discount in tuition. They might actually encourage you differently, that this is going to be paying you better, this is in demand, all of these different things. And what you may not know is that there is basically a certain agenda, especially the feminist agenda, that is wanting to basically compete. And of course, you and, well, your daughters and the girls, they basically become this area of testing. So they would be the ones to say, hey, we want to prove our point. We want to prove that women can be, I don't know, working out there, as in perhaps maybe, maybe different types of engineering, just so that we can prove to basically the in theory and in practice that women can be as good. I'm not saying that they can't be as good, or at least in certain fields they can't be as good, but we're basically seeing that there is an agenda that is trying to prove a point, and using perhaps your daughters and yourselves to basically prove a point. And you would be sometimes battling yourself, trying to prove this point when you're probably not made for that. It's exactly like if I were to put you in construction to prove a point that, hey, she can also work in construction, but she wasn't made to work in construction. Her muscle mass is not the same. Well, we can't just talk about muscle mass without talking about psychological difference as well. Now, that's very important. If we're talking about psychological difference, we're also talking about a completely social dynamic that is different. So not until we acknowledge these differences are we really being just and fair to women. We won't be capable of being fair to women unless we are basically recognizing these differences. Sorry, I'm getting an important phone call. Just 1 minute. Oh, that was nice. That was very nice. That was actually my husband. He's out and he's like, we want to get me something. And I thought a cheesecake and a cappuccino would do, because I'm trying to do a good job, right? All right. And let's continue. So, yeah, alhamdulillah, 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 getting a good husband and is worth everything. Ladies, wallahi, it's worth everything. Not because of the cappuccino and cheesecake, but because of everything.
لا تحسدي حالك، ما بيحسد المال إلا
All right,
صاحبه.
فضحت حالي exactly, not because of that.
لسه بعدك آمن من هي.
Exactly, not because of that. It's
يلا
just
الله
because,
يستر الله يستر.
Amin, ya Rabbi, Amin. Okay, so let's continue. So, of course, not until we recognize these differences are we really giving women their justice. This is extremely important because the second, it's exactly if, you are putting women to rally or probably race with men, perhaps, let's say in the Olympics. Well, you know very well that, their muscle mass, their heart, of course, their lungs, there's no way that we can fight and ignore the facts and think that, no, we're going to put her within this and that, yeah, we're going to have her compete. And you're going to ignore the facts that her blood flow, the heart, the lungs, and the muscle mass, everything is different. For sure, she's not going to be capable of competing with the guys, whether in the Olympics or whether we're speaking about perhaps different jobs like in construction, carrying all these different heavy items. So therefore, to put her in there is not doing her justice. So, of course, Islam comes in and says, well, listen, in order to recognize takrim al-mar'a. What is takrim al-mar'a? Takrim al-mar'a is to recognize the weaknesses, to recognize the strengths, to recognize the capacities, and to also push to a certain potential. That's what takrim really means. Takrim and honoring women is not necessarily to say, hey, ladies, take off your hijab and therefore you're going to be free, etc. That's not giving her honor. That's basically just wanting to convince her that she would be free when in reality she's just becoming free to other people's access. And that's not free. That's basically putting her basically cheap for others. To really give her that honor, you need to make her of value. You need to let others and herself basically see her value, and her value is basically in giving her modesty. And that way, those predators will not see her as easy access and think of it as cheap meat and cheap flesh and basically start taking it as something that is in easy access. So this is just one of those examples, but that's the same thing if we're talking about the dynamics in marriage as well. If we are letting women and say, hey, it's all about you going out there, taking, and there's one thing that is very common that we would hear people saying that at least in our times in Arabi, they would use the word that your degree is they'll use the word slah, which basically means a weapon or also mean ammunition. So if you're looking at that lexicon, if you were to say that your degree is a weapon, you start wondering, okay, is this a weapon to use against the challenges in life? Yes, you can understand it that way, but do they necessarily see the challenges as somehow an enemy? Not always. In fact, most of the times they don't see it as an enemy, but they definitely do see, based on this terminology, most of the times it is actually to mean that this husband is a possible enemy, and therefore you need to have this degree to somehow fight this husband with it, and that way you will be gaining the freedom. And here's the dangerous thing about this lexicon. If you're using this word as husband being an enemy and or at least your degree being a weapon, etc., and giving the inference that the husband is an enemy, that's a very dangerous thing, because of that second that you see that the husband is a possible enemy, in that same second, then you're going to be coming with a mindset that marriage is a battlefield.
Because that's a military lexicon right there. When you say silah, you're talking about a military term. You're talking about a military description for something that is supposed to be perhaps, we can probably call it an aid. We can probably call it maybe a treasure. Look at the difference. If you were to use this is a treasure, then using silah. Okay, the word treasure is letting you see it as, something of value. But the word silah or weapon is letting you see it as an armor, as basically a weapon. And so, which is really dangerous, because the second that you see it that way, you are then seeing that there is a certain mindset that is creating a certain narrative in how we see marriage, how we see our relationship, how we see our spouses, how we see our children, and therefore we would think of working outside or being basically out there, that is somehow supposed to be freedom, somehow that is supposed to be a place of power, autonomy, and all that goes on and on and on. Okay, so we just need to make sure that we are not let's call it indoctrinated without us realizing. We have to look at these terms and scrutinize them before they come into our minds and create different narratives and influence our relationships and influence the way we would see our marriage, our relationship, our husbands, our children, our parents. The list goes on. And then, of course, without us realizing, someone else is creating the shaitanic term, the satanic term, exactly the way that shaitan had come in and said, أَوَلَا أَدُلُّكَ عَلَى شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْدِ. He just called it شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْد, the tree of eternity. And why? Because he wanted to convince him that by eating from this tree, that somehow if he becomes a person that eats from the tree of eternity, he would consume basically from the tree of eternity, which would make him eternal. Eternal actually means that somehow he would become divine as well. He would battle the divine. He would become a person that is beyond time. He would become a person that is not controlled by time. And certainly that's the only thing that the divine and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can or is actually capable of doing. But of course, you could say, well, you might say, well, what's the big idea of eating from the tree? Why was that even considered a sin? The problem with that is when you say that this is a tree of eternity, the inference is that he was convincing him that somehow he can blend with the divine. Somehow he can have divine features. Somehow that was separating him from Tawheed. Think of it as exactly what people would think of different emblems or different I guess these things that they would think that, hey, if you were to wear this, it's going to take away all the different evil things, or if you lucky charm, it's going to basically give you a lucky thing happening in life, and who knows what, and the list goes on and on. In other words, basically a type of superstition. All right, but that's basically letting the person get indoctrinated into shirk. That's the problem with it. The problem wasn't just eating from the tree. It wasn't any kind of a tree. He was indoctrinated to eating from a tree which was labeled by Iblis as the tree of eternity. So just think of it that way in order to understand, well, why was that even a sin? And also understand what are we looking at in terms of the different influences that might actually be affecting us here and there. So we're going to go back to our slide right there. This let me see what you're seeing. And okay, here we go. We're going to go back to our slide right there. So we went over masculinity. Right now, we're going to be going over, let's say, a certain number of pieces when it talks about femininehood. So we talked about these ayat right there and what they basically teach us. Let's go over some of the things. Women may have natural things that may affect their behavior, but are still held accountable. Okay, so what is that supposed to mean and where do we get that from? Maybe I should have actually made this one up there. That way it'd be better. Okay, let's see. So there is a hadith. I want you to look at this one. Narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. كمل من الرجال كثير ولم يكن من النساء إلا آسيا امرأة فرعون ومريم بنت عمران وأن فضل عائشة على النساء كفضل الثريد على سائر الطعام. Let me explain this one. Many men were perfect, but very few women were, except Asiya, she was, Maryam, Asiya, basically the wife and the spouse of the Pharaoh, Maryam bint Imran, Maryam, the daughter of Imran, basically Prophet Isa's mother, and the preference of Sayyidah Aisha over other women is like the preference of tharid. Tharid is basically it's a type of a food which is which basically was considered as kind of like like a very special food. The comparison between, say, the Aisha over other women is basically like the preference of tharid over other meals. Now, here's one thing. This hadith, of course, many would, they would know this hadith, but then, sometimes it's like, okay, how do we understand this? So number one is that when it says كَمُلَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ كَثِيرٌ, very many men were basically perfect. Okay. So is this hadith basically saying that it is impossible for women to become perfect? In other words, what does perfect mean? Perfect doesn't necessarily mean as infallible. Okay, that's not what we're talking about, but we're talking about the, ideal, being ideal to a certain level. Okay, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about ideal. Okay, now when you're talking about this hadith, some scholars understood and interpreted this hadith that this is giving me an exclusivity. In other words, it's telling me that this is exclusive to these mentioned women, that they were the only ones ideal. Other scholars, that's not what they understood. They said, well, in Lugha Arabiya, we can say وَلَمْ يَكْمُلْ مِنَ النِّسَاء. We can say that very few women were, for example, as in this hadith, very few women were ideal, except these women, but that's basically to tell us that it is possible and it's not exclusive to these women, but these are examples of some of the women that were ideal. Okay, so that's what they understand. And in Lugha Arabiya, at least the second opinion the second opinion of scholars, they said, well, this is in Lugha Arabiya. This is in Lugha Arabiya that can be explained that way, and therefore to tell us that it is not impossible for a woman to be ideal, but this hadith is giving us an example of ideal women, which wallahu alam is actually the preponderant ruling, that this isn't making it exclusive to these women to be ideal, but is giving us an example for women that did become ideal compared to other women. So where did they get that exception, or at least that interpretation, that it's actually giving me an example and not an exclusivity? Well, basically they took it from here. كَفَضْلِ الثَّرِيدِ عَلَى سَائِرِ الطَّعَامِ. So he said, well, I mean, when you talk about kafadli tharid, you're talking about, a certain food basically preferred over other foods. Are you really talking about that, that is necessarily always the case, or sometimes, of course, you need other things, and this is relative in that we basically are seeing that, you know, there are certain preferences, and there are certain people, so just like certain foods do actually hold, you know, the ideal, but that doesn't mean there isn't another ideal food. Or there, of course, you know, we're not comparing women to food, but the Prophet ﷺ did actually compare Sayyidah Aisha to, you know, give us an example, food, but that was not at all to say this is you know, somehow being inferior, because this is metaphorical. This is metaphorical to actually say, you know, she's just as we would prefer this meal over the others, but that's basically metaphorical to help us understand what we're really talking about. And of course, there are other evidences that they actually said the word illa. They said illa, which is al-istithna, or the exception in Lugha Arabiya, can not necessarily only mean exclusivity, or at least in a, you know, something that is exclusive to something, but can mean as an example to something, or laying out, you know, think of it as a colon or a semicolon right there, and telling me, well, here are some examples of these women that had made it to being ideal. Okay, let's see. Now, when you're looking at that one, you know, I wanted to mention this hadith because many women would, you know, be confused about this, so needed to remove that misconception. Ibn al-Qayyim, he basically had said, إن الإسلام سوى بين الرجل والمرأة في العبادات البدنية والمالية كالوضوء والصلاة، ثم جعلها على النصف من الرجل في الدية والشهادة والميراث والعقيقة. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made basically women and men equal into the different matters, such as in worship, so the way women would make their salah or make their hajj or make their ibadah is basically the same, except that they may have differences based on the differences in their bodies, such as getting a menstrual cycle or anything like that, or the differences basically in their body, in other words, physical differences, or even in terms of money and financial, or even wudu, salah, siyam, you know, different things may vary in certain areas, but in general, you know, they are equal in most of these areas. So they would make the same wudu, they would make the same, basically consider the same finances, etc. They would have the same rights. Okay, yet in al-uqubat, basically in criminal law, women would not be basically trialed the same way. In fact, it would be different. It would be less. They would not hold the same responsibility. They would not hold the same accountability in certain crimes, not all, but in certain crimes, and certainly even when it comes to things like blood money, or even witness, or even inheritance, or aqiqah, there would be the differences because of the difference in nature. Now, of course, it's quite interesting how sometimes, well, we can talk about shahada right there is, yes, it's pretty obvious because the ayah was making it clear that this is not at all to say that women are inferior, but this is أن تضل إحداهما فتذكر إحداهما الأخرى. If one would forget, the other one would basically come in to remind her of what she had forgotten. As in terms of mirath, it was or inheritance, it was made clear that it was in order to let the men be the ones to be in support, and basically to use this money to support the women and be there as caregivers. And certainly when you see today, I do know, and it's definitely obvious that not many men are holding the position of their responsibility of what Islam is asking them to do, okay? And which basically is perhaps be caretakers for their sisters, their mothers, or whatever it is. And unfortunately, they're not doing their responsibility. There's no question about that. Unfortunately, the society is right now definitely women are victims in many ways, but I would say victims in many ways as a result of secular practices, as a result of Jahiliyyah, in both ways. The Jahiliyyah of secularism and the Jahiliyyah of misogyny, the Jahiliyyah of feminism. And I would say that the feminism had done more harm to women than the misogyny that was practiced in tradition. You know, I know this sounds like a very big and a very strong statement to make, but I will say it again and again. Feminism harmed women and was abusive to women more than the misogyny that, and what I mean by misogyny, I mean the misogyny that was basically, definitely it's Jahiliyyah, but the misogyny that existed within our societies is way less in its impact in abusing women than feminism. I think feminism had done a lot more harm than the misogyny that existed. Definitely, we don't want misogyny. Definitely, we don't want that type of abuse. There's no question about it. We don't want misogyny because it's Jahiliyyah. And we don't want feminism because it's Jahiliyyah. And that's why we need to go back to understanding Islam. We need to go back to basically the foundation of how we understand Islam based on Quran and Sunnah, and definitely not of the influence of any of those different Jahiliyyahs. So as for Idiyah, it would be half, and there is a debate between scholars. And from what I remember, majority of the scholars had actually said that the blood money for women is half the blood money for men. Wait a minute, does that mean her life is worth half? No, it doesn't mean her life is worth half, because if the family had chosen that the person that killed their daughter, for example, is to be killed, then that would be qasas and he would get killed. Okay, in other words, would basically get killed as a punishment for killing their own daughter. But if we're talking about blood money, if we're talking about diya, then yes, it would be half of the amount. So we're talking about, let's say, 100 camels for a blood money for a man. It would be 50 camels for women. So why would it be half if we're talking about the same value of life? So when you speak about blood money is not whatsoever the value of human life. Whatsoever. So if you were to think that blood money is the price of a human life, then you're definitely going to come with the conclusion that, hey, you're saying that her life is half the value. But that's not actually true. If the family were to choose that the man that killed their daughter, for example, they weren't going to take the diya and they wanted him to be killed, you could see then we would say life for life. So the diya is more of a compensation for the financial loss and not necessarily the value of life. It's not for the value of life. Because Islam considered whoever kills a person, an innocent person, then it is as if they had killed all mankind. So that's basically the Quran letting us know that the value of human life is not something that can necessarily or in any way can be measured based on money or based on 100 camels or based on certain value. But this is a compensation. The diya is a compensation for the financial loss, in other words, to support. That's one. Number two is that the diya, if let's say a woman was killed, her family is the one that's going to get the blood money. It's not her. Of course, she's dead. It's not her that's going to get the blood money. It's her family. So the financial loss or the blood money is to compensate for the financial loss. In the case of a woman being killed, the financial loss and the impact it has on the family is half the financial losses that if this was a man. So in other words, if a woman is killed, her husband would also get from the diya, all right? But if a man was killed, the amount that a woman would get from the diya, being the spouse of this man that got killed, would basically be double the amount. So the woman would be compensated double the amount for the killing of her own husband, then compare to the man and what he would be getting in the case of the killing of his own wife. You see it? So who's actually here the one to really get the compensation? Who's really the one to really get that, let's call it that extra money? Is it the man or is it the woman? So in that situation, to understand that blood money and that diya, we have to understand that it's not the price of a life, but it's a compensation for, let's call it the financial loss. And let's go for the other part, which is al-aqiqah. For al-aqiqah, there is actually a debate. I'll just make it, I'll just make it short. For al-aqiqah, the debate between scholars in regards to al-aqiqah, do we slaughter 2 sheep for girls the same as for boys? Majority of scholars actually considered that no, because we do have a hadith that basically says it's 1 sheep for a girl and 2 sheep basically for boys. And is that necessarily because they're superior? Why are we doing 2? It's usually because people are more excited in the event of a male birth than a female birth. And aqiqah is supposed to be expressing basically the gratitude for the blessings and what blessings they would have. So since this person is considering that they're, let's say, double the happiness, then in that situation, we're going to ask you to do the sunnah of doing double, basically the slaughter. Double the slaughter in the event of a male birth compared to a female birth. Okay, I forgot to mention one thing. I did say about the blood money. I did say that majority of the scholars actually said that the diya was half. Only 2 is from what I remember. It was Ibn Abi Layla and who else? It was Ibn Abi Layla, and there was another scholar, but majority of the scholars, they actually had considered that as more of an aberration in fiqh and not necessarily something that is unanimous that they would basically see based on what that practice of the Prophet ﷺ and even the Sahaba was like. Now, is there a specific text in this regards? No, there isn't a specific text, but there is a practice. And of course, the Sahaba, they would basically pass on what the Prophet ﷺ had practiced, and part of the sunnah is not only just what he had said, but also what he had practiced. Just keep that one in mind, because the sunnah is not exclusive to what was said verbally. The sunnah could also be what was done. The sunnah could also be the report of what was accepted by him, when he had witnessed it, when all of that was part of the sunnah. Let's see the other part of it. And let's see, the differences in roles due to the differences in nature. Let's see, and he said, وَهَذَا مِنْ كَمَالِ شَرِيعَتِهِ وَحِكْمَتِهَا وَلُطْفِهَا فَإِنَّ مصلحة العباد البدنية ومصلحة العقوبات الرجال والنساء مشتركون فيها. Okay, so I'm just going to make the story short. Let me just quote, I wish I had translated this one for you, but I'll do it right now, and this book is called أعلام الموقعين or إعلام الموقعين, differences of opinions between scholars. So what is this book about? So you could see Ibn al-Qayyim, he basically said, and from the completion of the Islamic Sharia, basically, and from the wisdom it carries, and even from the gentleness and ease that it carries, is that it basically considers maslahat al-ibad, basically considers the interest and fulfilling the interest of people, whether we're speaking about the different things physically or even in terms of criminal laws, and basically the areas that men and women are similar. In other words, they are basically the same in it. Then that's when you would see that they're going to be held accountable in the same way. They're going to be given the same instructions. But once, of course, you could see that there is a difference between them, that's when you will see a difference in the rulings, such as in Jumu'ah. Praying Jumu'ah is obligatory on men. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ had actually said in the hadith, if any man would leave and not pray 3 consecutive Jumu'ahs, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically stamped on their heart and basically had labeled them and classified them as part of the munafiqeen or part of the hypocrites. And certainly, same thing when we're talking about al-jama'ah, same thing if we're talking about involvement in jihad or military, joining the military and so forth. It definitely is not the same. And of course, when we're speaking about different rulings as well. So of course, but at the end, this is to basically come to a very important ayah, which is من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فنحيينه حياة طيبة ولنجزينهم أجرهم بأحسن ما كانوا يعملون. At the end, of course, we know that the general default rule is that whoever does righteous, whether male or female, while they are in faith, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will resurrect them a good life, and He will reward them the reward of better than what they had done. So in other words, it's really the intentions. It really is basically what they are presenting and not necessarily their own masculinity or femininehood that matters. And of course, we know this hadith. I absolutely love this hadith. Let's see. Jibril عليه السلام was, this hadith is actually authentic. It's in al-Bukhari. You could see the number of the hadith that Jibril عليه السلام had come to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, read upon Khadija the salam or the greetings from her Lord Almighty and from me, and give her, like a glad tidings that she will have a fortress or a house in Jannah that is built of qasab. لا صخب فيه ولا نصب. There's, it's quite interesting that لا صخب فيه. What are we talking about? Loud noise? Are we talking about evil things? Are we nasab, no pain, no harm, no illness? Of course, it's going to include all of that. But at the end, just say, of course, that Sayyidah Khadija right there was also greeted by her Lord Almighty, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's see, of course, there was also a question. Let's look at Salama. She basically had a certain, let's call it a certain, should we call it an objection? Or should we call it question? Or should we call it concern? You can see the word that you might want to choose for that. Let's see, what did she say? So she came to the Prophet ﷺ and she said, يا نبي الله ما لي أسمع الرجال يذكرون في القرآن والنساء لا يذكرن. Why do I see that men are frequently mentioned in the Quran, yet women are not mentioned? Why so? That's when this ayah was revealed. إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما. Okay, what do we get out of this ayah? So the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, maybe we should make this bigger, right? So you can all see it. Okay, we're going to make it right there. Okay, believing men, believing women, and al-qanitin, obedient men and obedient women, the honest men and the honest women, the patient men and the patient women, and the ones that are dedicated in their salah, basically al-khashi'in wal-khashi'at, fearful maybe, fearful of their Lord, men and women, and those that would give sadaqah, those that would donate from the men and women, those that would fast from the men and women, those that would guard their private parts from the men and women, and those that would remember the Lord Almighty from the men and the women are basically prepared forgiveness and a magnificent reward. So what is that? To basically let us know that when we're speaking about reward, when we're speaking about accountability, it basically is the same in the akhirah, but we're talking about differences at least that is centered around one, interest, capacity, and potential. Let's do it again. We're talking about interest, what basically gives them their interest and what they were made for, basically. That's number one. Number two, capacity and potential, and certainly the potential, or at least your mission and your aim to basically telling the women to get to a certain potentials, they're going to be different than the potential that you want women or men to compete in. Two different biologies, two different psychologies, two different bone structures, two different muscle mass structures, two different, structure and two different anatomies. Then therefore you just have to recognize that they were built for something different and their capacities are different and therefore their potentials are going to be different. So to not recognize these differences is definitely not doing them justice. Okay, and of course, at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said the believing men, women, and men, they support one another in the mission of Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ. At the end, the believing men and the believing women, they are supporters of one another. And when you say supporters, and look at the word awliya here, I want you to look at this one because, I frequently get, especially in certain, let's call it traditional cultures, they would come in and basically say, a woman is supposed to be obedient and therefore she should not object her husband. And we would say, objection. That's not necessarily true. She can object because here the ayah says, al-mu'minun al-mu'minat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd, basically letting us know that she can object not only to her husband, but she can object even publicly if this is, of course, within the Quran and Sunnah. And we know the story of Khawla bint Thalaba when she had objected about a culture that basically, when it was a common culture at the time that men, whenever they would get angry, they could just basically say, hey, you're just going to be treated exactly the way that I would treat my mother and sister, basically, that you're not going to be treated as a wife in intimacy or any of that because that's it, you're done, in other words. And of course, Khawla bint Thalaba objected to that, went to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ said, well, all I know is that you are not, you're not basically married anymore. In other words, you're just, it is impermissible for you to be intimate with him. That's all I know. And she said, but that can't be. And she debated with the Prophet ﷺ, literally debated, and that's what the ayah is saying, arguing with the Prophet ﷺ, because the ayah says, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ. The word tujadiluka is a person that debates, a person that basically, and by the way, the reason why she got into this whole mess okay, is because she debated with her husband. She debated with her husband. It was debating who was this ayah revealed based on, as a result of. In other words, it was one figure. Is it based on this person or that person? She is a very argumentative person, and she debated her husband and did not end it there, but she went to debate the Prophet ﷺ himself. You could see, subhanAllah, different personalities. You could see that, there are certain women that, don't want to be silenced. And certainly she definitely went and felt that there's something that I need to say. There's something that I need to voice, that this can't be right. So she was advocating on behalf of herself and definitely on behalf of other women. And that's when the ayah was revealed, coming to support and voice خولة بنت ثعلبة and say قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله. The Lord Almighty had heard the woman arguing with you and complaining to her Lord. And the ayah continues. قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله والله يسمع تحاوركما. And the Lord Almighty hears your conversation. Now I want you to look at this تحاوركما, because I want you to see this isn't at all Khawla somehow trespassing her boundaries, okay? Because the ayah says tahawurakuma. She was not trespassing her boundaries in disrespecting the Prophet ﷺ. That's why he called it tahawurakuma. She was politely arguing and asking the Prophet ﷺ, and basically telling him that this cannot be fair, that as a woman that is contributing into this marriage, that just all of a sudden I could be not married and not even regarded as a divorcee, and right there basically be thrown like that and with no rights, even though I'm the one that's contributing everything within this household. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had called it tahawurakuma. She was not disrespecting the Prophet ﷺ. And this is to object, because we had seen a couple videos out there saying that, yeah, we can object and we can debate the sunnah and we can debate that. And I was like, no, wait a minute. You are trespassing right there, because that is a fitna. That's a fitna. To actually, in fact, that's kufr. To object the sunnah, to object to the Prophet ﷺ and say, you know what, I'm basically doing the same thing as Khawla bint Tha'laba. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it tahawurkuma. Where are you going? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically let us know that اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. أتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. That's it. There's no objection to object sunnah, to object the ahadith, and to say, yeah, well, no, I'm going to debate this and I'm going to no, you're going to a completely different area, and you're definitely going to that fitna. Not at all. Okay, let's see the other part, which is al-qawama, or manhood, patience, responsibility, or what is it? Now, one thing I would like to say, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. When you speak about qawama, there are a number of different things to say about it. It's not an easy thing to just, I guess, summarize. I did an 80-paged, no, not this one. This wasn't the 81. That was 40 pages, actually. Just studying over 40 different tafsir just about this ayah. الرجال قوامون على النساء. Okay? And it was in a class, epistemology class, and it was to go over this ayah and just see how the interpretation and how their explanation, basically the interpretation for this ayah, how it developed or evolved throughout history. So I was going to go back all the way to the early books of tafsir, al-Tabari, and then we're going to go perhaps another tafsir in the 4th century, another other tafsir in the 5th century, 6th century, etc., going upwards to see. Because in the books of tafsir or the books of fiqh, they would benefit from one another. They would benefit from one another. They would take from one another. And what I had realized is that there was a frequent quotation that was actually taken from some of the mufassirin, and then it became something that like an axiom. Everybody then considered it as, well, this is common sense and this is what it means. Let me explain what happened. So you had some scholars, in fact, majority of the scholars later at least, they said men are قوامون على النساء, and they explained قوامون as superior. And their evidence, they said, well, men are superior because they hold the sword, because they grow beards, because they ride on horses, because they become the Khalifa, because they become the Imams, because they become the ulama, because they become, and they listed some of these things. And we know that a lot of this is cultural. I mean, if a woman were to grow a beard, that wasn't going to be something that is acceptable. We are going to say, well, this is tashabbuh bil-rijal. We would like you to basically remove it. Okay, at least according to majority of the scholars, not according to Tabari. Okay, and in terms of swords, you know, today's men, I mean, they know nothing about swords, and you can have a fencer. I think her name was Ibtihaj Muhammad or something, who was a fencer, and definitely, you know, if you were to put a man in front of her, you know, you weren't going to be battling whatsoever. You're going to be, you know, not that I agree with women being fencers, not at all. Okay, dressing like that and doing all of that movement and all of that. No, that's not to be in public anyhow. But that's a different story. Okay, but does that mean that men are by nature that they carry swords and can battle basically better? Of course not. That's more of a cultural thing. In terms of, oh, they also had listed al-amama as well. They said turban. And that men wear a turban, therefore this is that men are superior. And that's actually a very, let's say, a wrong interpretation. And definitely there's a cultural influence. There's no question about that. But the ayah was very clear in saying الرجال قوامون. And in order to explain قوامون, you definitely need to use the word قامة, and need to understand basically the etymology for that word, and two, basically the context within it. And you also want to use that understanding based on the practice of the Sahaba to make sure that you have the right explanation. Now, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did call men and women in another ayah as that there are qawwamuna, and of course, لله شهداء, and they're so they're قوامون شهداء, they're etc. So this is talking about men and women. They're basically living up to a certain principle. But of course, when it said الرجال قوامون على النساء, we're speaking about a different context here. It's talking about the relationship between men and women, and it used the word الرجال and not الذكور. And we know that the Quran, when it uses the word الرجال, that's a different level. That's a different level of let's say, defining masculinity, that what really makes manhood is when they are قوامون على النساء. What is قوامون على النساء? So you had basically a number of different scholars explain that they are, number one, فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. So you're talking about there are certain biological differences. Of course, one is better than the other. And some scholars did understand, just wanted to note that, okay, I don't want to yet get into the preponderant piece of it yet, but I wanted to lay out some of what scholars had mentioned. So, فضل الله بعضهم على بعض, you did have some scholars actually say men are superior, and others actually say it's not an issue if you're superior. Some other scholars, they rejected that and they said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that that previous ayah that we did before, that من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى فلنحيينه حياة طيبة. So, and of course, إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. So this can't be superior, but you still had some scholars actually say superior in general. Okay, and of course, the second reason, they said وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم, and for what they spend. In other words, the general and the default, let's say, role within the household is that men are supposed to be the breadwinners. This is the default. Yet, can a woman be the breadwinner? Yes, but the woman being the breadwinner, we're going to talk about what if she is working and does she contribute within the household, within her income? What does she do, etc. We're going to talk about that, okay? But right now we're just discussing this ayah. وَبِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ, the default is that men are supposed to be the breadwinners. Can they be breadwinners? Yes, they can be, but that's not necessarily the preferred, or at least the ideal position. Okay, so now we could see when the ayah says قوامون, we could see that it basically connected it with two things. One, we're talking about فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. We could see that there were certain features, there were certain descriptions, there were certain gifts, there were certain capacities, certain potentials that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given men and did not give women, which basically gives them that equipment to be fit for that position, which is number one, the differences that we had just mentioned. Number two, وَبِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ, and to be the breadwinners. Let's just assume that the man is not the one working within this household and it is the woman that's working. Does that give qawama to the woman and not the man? The answer is no, it does not. It does not give the qawama to the woman just because she is working and he happens to be unemployed. Does not whatsoever make him lose the qawama. But in practice, I will let you know just a hint and just a footnote. Once the husband is unemployed, yes, it does have an impact in the relationship, and a huge impact in the relationship between the man and the woman within this household, because of course she would then see that he's not contributing the same way, and then she basically starts feeling that she's got the upper hand. إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ, except to those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically blessed with his mercy to not take advantage. If the husband is probably unemployed, not for his own lazy reason, okay, that's a different story. If he's unemployed for a lazy reason that he doesn't want to work, then that's definitely a problem. And she definitely has to say, hey, listen, this is not acceptable. You are the one that's supposed to be working, not me, okay? But for those situations where perhaps maybe an illness, perhaps maybe got unemployed because he can't find the job, etc., and certainly then it's a different situation. And then a woman should be the one to also understand in that situation that it's probably not as a result of his laziness, but as a result of probably disability, or as a result of him basically applying for all these jobs, but then rizq ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so like I said, does not lose it, but of course, just to help us understand. Now, of course, you will see in different tafsir, or at least in different interpretations, the Quran interpreted ayat, you would see some will use caregivers, some will use preservers, some will use leaders, some will use all of that. So all of that does actually help the word qawam to, give it an explanation. But the word qawam generally means from the root qama ala shay, meaning that they are also in supervision, in authority, in responsibility. All of that basically comes from the root qama. Qama ala shay, meaning that they are overseeing, that it's basically growing in the right direction, that it's basically taken care of, that it's basically well maintained. So in other words, their responsibility is not only in bringing the substances, but their responsibility is also in maintaining structure, in maintaining security, in maintaining this home, basically to be the home that is bringing in the fruit of what it was designed for in the first place, which is to bring healthy kids, to bring healthy kids in their deen, healthy kids in their health, in their life, basically, healthy kids that are mentally healthy, and certainly chastity and security and etc., and basically have the right also substance in terms of wealth and finance and all of that also available. So just wanted to mention the thing about al-Qawamun. And unfortunately, there are a number of different attempts to challenge this ayah, especially from a number of different women that would think that that Islamic feminism, I will say it that way, even though I see that as an oxymoron, but would think that it serves Islam to basically discuss that. When I had said that certainly in some of the books of tafsir, you may have traces of perhaps maybe, like I said, cultural influence or misogynistic, etc. There's no question about that. They're human beings at the end. But that does not mean that we would replace those books of tafsir with a new type of a new Jahiliyyah tafsir. So just as I acknowledge that to say qawamun, that men are superior because they wear turbans, because they hold swords, because they grow beards, because all of the different things that I had mentioned, just because I refuse to accept that that is the reason, because there was no ahadith necessarily referring to this preference or this superiority or this leadership or this qawam or whatever you want to basically use the term into explaining al-qawama, then you would have to understand that to use another feminist interpretation is also equal in its jahiliyyah. Just keep that one in mind. We don't want to take away a certain jahiliyyah and bring about and replace it with a new jahiliyyah. But we want to make sure that we understand the Quran right and understand basically Islam based on the lens of Quran and Sunnah, and not confuse our resources and think that, hey, I'm basically freeing Islam from, for example, these influences by putting in a new influence. So just keep that one in mind. Okay, the relationship between masculine and feminine, basically, they complete one another. What's the evidence? The evidence is basically right there, just like we had mentioned in the ayah before, basically awliya'u ba'd. They are awliya'u ba'd to basically mean that they are supporters. They are authority over one another. So certainly, just like when we had Khawla bint Thalaba, they are also supporters of one another. They give basically the same mission. They get the same mission. They have the same mission to order for what is good, forbid what is wrong, and they would turn to their Lord Almighty in zakah. And even when they see money, they recognize that it's supposed to be a contribution for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they would basically obey Allah and His Messenger. So in other words, the centricity is basically going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not whatsoever as the centricity to manhood or centricity to womanhood either. Both are jahiliyyah, but certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did say, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, and that لِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ الْبَيْضَاوي had basically explained that, and he said that means يَقُومُونَ عَلَيْهِنَّ قِيَامَ الْوُلَاةِ عَلَى الرَّعِيَّةِ. What does that mean? He said, well, what that means is that they would be basically responsible over the women as the person in authority over basically the people that they're governing. So what does that mean? So here you actually had most of the scholars support that interpretation, is that يَقُومُ عَلَى الشَّيْء is more in regards to governance, in regards to authority. So yes, majority of the scholars, and does the ayah basically contain this element that men are in authority over women? Yes, it does. What's the evidence? Well, the evidence is in the ahadith, where you would have numerous ahadith that ordered women to be obedient to their husbands. So as long as he's not ordering for something haram, be obedient to the husband. And basically part of that is giving, let's say, respect, is giving also that following. Okay, so follow your husband, meaning that if he leads towards a certain decision making and you basically disagree, you definitely have the right to say, well, here's why I object to this opinion. I think it's wrong for 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 reasons, whatever it is. Okay, and definitely you have the right to your voice be heard. But at the end, if he makes the final decision, even though it might not be according to you and according to your evaluation, it might not be the best decision, he will be held accountable for the aftermath. He'll be responsible to fix it. He'll be responsible for all the different things that basically are impacted by this decision making, and in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and even in this life. Okay, he'll be held accountable, he'll be basically responsible, he'll learn a lesson, etc. And in the future, especially for those newly married women, I would say in the beginning, you might see this objection, and you might actually be really like that Queen Saba. Okay, Queen of Saba. And later on, if you are a woman of wisdom, once, let's say, experience lets your husband see your potentials and the number of times that you were right in, that's when your husband will start recognizing that you do have the potential, just like Salama, just like perhaps Queen Saba, just like Queen of Saba, or just like Khadija, that you are a person of wisdom, you are a person of great potential. So don't necessarily think that, yeah, fight it in the beginning. In the beginning, you might feel that he doesn't recognize your potentials and only sees you as a woman, especially in the early stages of marriage. Because in the early stages of marriage, he wanted to marry a woman and not a person that is sharing this autonomy, sharing this power. That's how he saw you, at least as a woman. But once you start taking on a different role, that's when, from my experience, that's when you would start seeing this friction happen. So I would say, ladies, if you are really experienced, if you are really wise, and based on your evaluation, that decision is wrong, Just lay it out there, and time will prove to him that you have the experience and that your voice shall be heard and that you basically should be included in the decision making. But that does not come by saying, yeah, I should be included. And it's not a slogan to carry, but it's actually an experience for them to recognize. With time, you will see that you will be regarded and that they will really see it. And that comes, and remember this, leaders don't usually know that they are leaders. It's not that they are, right there, right there, everybody sees them as a leader and yeah, we're going to make you a leader. No, it doesn't happen like that. They recognize with time their potentials, and that's when people will let the leader basically know that they have certain qualities that others do not have. In other words, the leader would not be a leader without the people letting this leader know that they have qualities of leadership. So it's important sometimes. Don't rush. I don't want to say I want you to be a leader, but I want you to be patient sometimes and not use the type of, I'm going to battle this and I'm going to, battle this and I'm going to let him know and all of that. No, I want you to demonstrate with wisdom your potentials, and the other person will start recognizing it without needing any slogans to basically carry out there. A alim based within their words. If a alim would speak, you would know the ilm that their words contain. If a wise person would speak, you would know the wisdom and you would recognize it. And if a foolish person speaks, you would see the foolishness based on their basically words. The discourse they speak in would reflect what's actually up there in the box in their brain. So with time, you will see that once you demonstrate and once you say, and a person of wisdom does not speak of battle, but a person of wisdom is a person that is gentle. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, when he talked to al-Mundhir ibn al-Ashaj ibn Qais, he said that he has khislatain, he has two different features that Allah and His Messenger love. And he mentioned that they are basically al-hilm wal-ana. Al-hilm wal-ana. What is al-hilm? Hilm is basically forbearance. It's not an impulsive person to retaliate and to fight. No. They're basically forbearance. And al-ana, they're gentle, they're not impulsive. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. But of course, that takes us to the other question. Well, why is man to be the person in charge and not a woman? Why can't I be the person in charge? Remember, this is taklif and not tashrif. This is a responsibility, not an honor. They'll be held accountable. And certainly, men have the responsibility to figure out solutions. And we know that as women, we usually like to express our feelings than actually look for solutions. And that's why in many of the cases that had come to me, the man is looking for a solution to a problem and the woman just wants to be heard. She just wants to be heard. So for most of those cases, when men and women would basically come to my office and I would say, listen, all I want you to do is just give her the amount of time to be heard. Give her the amount, just hear her. Just hear what she has to say. You can at the end say, your voice had been heard. Thank you for laying out your concern. Thank you for laying out your idea. This is the final decision making that we're going to be practicing. if it's not against Quran and Sunnah. Okay. And one thing is, when you see therapists, for example, the first thing that they would do is basically hear the patient speak, and the person would talk, and this gives the person a sense of feeling that they're understanding me, they're hearing me. No one would understand me but my therapist, and that they're experts, when they might not have actually said much, and they might not have actually fully understood what this person is saying, but just by letting them talk their minds out helps them feel that I'm understood, I was heard, I was validated. So for the men struggling with their wives, I would say, hear what she has to say. That's giving her respect. Just hear what she has to say. Sometimes she's not looking for a solution. Sometimes she's just looking to ventilate and share her emotions. At the same time, I would say, ladies, do not treat your husband as your girlfriend. He can never be. Ladies, your husband can never fully understand how painful and how much of a burden motherhood is. As much as you try to explain the excruciating pain of labor, or perhaps the struggle that you are facing in maintaining the house and doing all of that, they'll never be able to understand it. The husband will come in and say, "What were you doing today?" And you're just staring, and you're like, okay, what am I going to explain? Where do I start? Do I start with how many times I picked up the toys? How many times I put food? How many times the kids basically needed a diaper change? How many times I did this and this? And you're like, okay, I just know that I was barely making it, and I just need time to sleep. And he will come home and just see the house upside down and wonder, what were you doing? And if you were to count what you were doing, you're going to fail, because it's more than what you can count. Ladies, men are not going to fully understand what you're going through. So sometimes just understand that they will not fully understand and fully comprehend your pains, or your emotions, or perhaps what you go through and all of that. And neither can a man think that a woman is going to fully comprehend what they go through either. There are certain things, a man has his boyfriends or guy friends that, they would share a completely different circle, the subjects, everything, all of that is completely different. In fact, their jokes with each other is sometimes you're like, what's so funny about that? But their jokes are completely different, and women's jokes are completely different. What makes a woman happy is completely different than what makes a man happy. What makes her comfortable is completely different. What makes a man happy is, hey, I need another friend that would help me make the right decisions. What makes a girl happy is, I need a friend to hear me, voice my pain, voice my feelings. She's not looking for a solution. She's looking for someone to pat on her back, to hear her emotions and hear her pains. So just to mention that one, just understanding, I guess, the nature that women are different from men. And one book that I always recommend before you get into trying to go to a therapist and all of that, read the book, Women Are from Venus and Men Are from Mars. Definitely read that book. There's an audio book for it. You can read it. The book has been translated for so many languages. Definitely read that book. I promise you, it will help you understand. And it's a book that is really easy to digest. It's not a book of psychology. It's not a book of I don't know, neuroscience or what, science, but it's a book of letting you see how the implication of the brain structure, the behavior is different, the concern is different, how it plays out differently. So sometimes to see it that you're not alone, ladies, trust me, your friend, your other friend, your other friend, they're basically going through the same exact thing. You know, the husband may not fully understand, and you would be like, he would be saying, where's the, let's say the keys or whatever. You're like, it's right there, it's on the table. And he's like, I don't see it, when it's right there. You go there and you're like, it's right here. You can't even see it. It's not just you, it's every single man. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you certain capacities that he did not have. Just recognize that. And of course, just seeing those differences are extremely important in order to live and embrace it rather than challenge it. Because if you're challenging your husband that, oh, this is what is ideal, this is what you need to do, it's exactly the same way that if your husband were to ask you to be based on his ideal image of what it means to be a man, then the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, if you are going to think that you're going to straighten her, or you're going to make her be like your boyfriend, you're just going to break her. And that's the same thing I would say. Ladies, if you think that that man is going to hear you the same way that he would hear his friends and etc., or how you would deal with your girlfriends, no. You need girlfriends or girlfriends, live with them. You can talk and just make sure you are basically sharing the right information, not sharing too much. You got to be really critical of what you share, but that's a different story. Okay. Men and women share humanity. The Prophet said, men and women are brethren to one another. And al-Khattabi, one of my favorite scholars, basically said, it basically means they are equal and similar to them in their creation and in some of their characteristics, basically, and therefore as if they had been split from the men. In other words, it's like they were split from them, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end said, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. And this is talking about men and women, because this is talking about human beings. They were created in the best of the creation. So to say that women are somehow inferior, well, this would actually be, let's say, easily, let's say, objected, or at least this ayah would refuse such statement to say superior, because, or to call women inferior. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ, and this is an inclusive men and women, human beings, that they were created in the best of creation. So if you say women are inferior, then you're basically going to contradict this ayah. Okay, certain rulings may be due to the differences, such as لا يبدين زينتهن, not expose their beautification, except of course to certain mahrams. And of course Islam orders man to be kind, affectionate with women. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, استوصوا بالنساء خيرا. استوصوا بالنساء خيرا. The Prophet ﷺ basically giving this order to men and telling them to basically consider in dealing with women in basically kindness. For women were created from basically that rib, and the top rib is basically certainly is also bent rib. Okay, so men and women duties, certainly there are certain things that they're the same. فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Seeking ilm is basically obligatory on men and women, and certainly applying Islam is obligatory onto both. And at the end, of course, the center is know that there is no God worthy of worship but Allah. Ask forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for the believing men and for the believing women. So this would actually mark the end for the set of slides. Okay, next week, inshallah, we'll be working on the fiqh of divorce. So yeah, we've got a couple things to talk about, the fiqh of divorce, inshallah. So yeah, that's when I guess, a number of different things that go, let's call it in structure, or at least go and call it in, what should we call it? Legal terms and all of that. Yeah, that's where we're going to get to. So this is it. Inshallah, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. If there are any questions, I would be happy. I'd be happy to hear them, or even if there are any, perhaps maybe suggestions or correction as well, that's okay too.